The photograph looks ordinary at first. A young couple stands beneath a pale summer sky, their clothes neat, their expressions carefully composed, as if they have practiced this moment many times before. The groom's hand rests lightly on the bride's arm. Her veil is thin, almost weightless, and the soft blur of the forest behind them suggests a quiet place, far from any town, far from noise, far from help. There is nothing unusual in their faces. No sign of fear. No trace of sorrow. But old photographs are patient things. They do not reveal everything at once. It is only when the image is enlarged, when the grain of time is pulled apart, that the first disturbance appears. The bride's right hand is not relaxed at her side. It is closed. Tightly. Too tightly for a moment meant to be joyful. Between her fingers, barely visible in the original print, is something dark. Not a flower. Not a ring. Not anything that should be there. Those who notice it often describe the same sensation. A sudden chill. The feeling that the room has grown smaller. The sense that they are no longer alone. And sometimes, late at night, when the lights are off and the photograph is no longer in sight, they swear they can hear it. A voice. Not loud. Not clear. Just enough to remind them that the forest in the background was never empty. And that the bride was not holding a secret. She was holding a message. The chest was not meant to be found. It lay beneath a thin layer of rotting leaves and damp soil, hidden between the twisted roots of two ancient trees at the very edge of the forest, where the light rarely stayed for long and the air carried the constant scent of wet bark and decay. Years of rain had darkened the wood, and time had eaten away at its metal fittings until they flaked like rusted skin. It was uncovered by chance, exposed when a fallen branch tore open the earth after a storm, revealing a corner of warped oak that did not belong to the ground. At first, it looked like nothing more than forgotten debris. But when it was pried loose, the weight of it suggested intention, not accident. Someone had taken care to bury it. Someone had wanted it to remain unseen. The lock was sealed with corrosion, and when it finally gave way, the sound was sharp, like a bone snapping. Inside, the air was stale and cold, carrying a smell that did not match the forest, a dry, enclosed scent, as if the box had been holding its breath for decades. Folded carefully within layers of oilcloth was a single photograph. The paper was thick, the edges soft with age. Dark stains marked one corner, stiff and brittle, as though something had once soaked into the fibers and then dried there. The image itself had faded to muted grays and browns, but the figures were still clear enough to recognize. A bride and groom stood side by side, framed by trees, their posture formal, their expressions calm in the way people learn to be when cameras required stillness and patience. There was no name written on the back. No date. No mark of ownership. Only the photograph, preserved with a care that felt excessive, almost reverent. What made the discovery unsettling was not the picture, but the place. The forest was old, older than the nearest village, older than the paths that cut through it. Locals avoided this stretch of land, though few could say exactly why. They spoke of strange echoes, of sounds that carried too far and lasted too long, of paths that seemed to change when no one was watching. Children were warned not to wander here, and hunters learned to turn back before dusk. To find something so deliberately hidden in such a place felt less like an accident and more like an interruption. The chest had not been lost. It had been left. And in being uncovered, it felt as though something that had been carefully buried, not only in soil but in memory, had been disturbed, and whatever had been waiting with it was no longer entirely contained. The photograph did not change at first. Under normal light, it remained what it had always appeared to be, a formal wedding portrait, stiff and orderly, the kind meant to be placed in a frame and set on a mantel, a quiet record of a single, hopeful day. The bride's dress fell in clean lines, her veil pale against the darker backdrop of trees. The groom stood straight, his expression measured, his eyes fixed on the unseen photographer. There was nothing, at a glance, that suggested unease. It was only when the image was carefully scanned and enlarged that the first irregularity emerged. At higher resolution, the grain of the paper became visible, each tiny flaw of age and chemical process standing out like a map of time itself. The folds in the fabric sharpened. The texture of the bark behind them grew rougher. And in the bride's right hand, something that had once been lost in shadow began to take form. Her fingers were not resting naturally. They were curved inward, tense, the knuckles slightly raised, as though she were gripping something small but significant. The shape was dark, uneven, and did not reflect light the way metal or glass should. It appeared almost absorbed by the surrounding shadows, as if it did not belong fully to the same space as the rest of the image. Further enhancement did not clarify it. Instead, the object seemed to resist definition. It was not a flower. It was not a ring. It was not any customary token of a wedding. Those who examined it closely found themselves returning to that detail again and again, unable to look away for long. There was a strange imbalance in the composition of the photograph, a subtle tension created by that single clenched hand. The bride's face, so composed, so calm, now felt less like a sign of happiness and more like a mask held in place by effort. Some suggested it was nothing more than a trick of light, a flaw in the print, a shadow deepened by age and staining. But the more the image was adjusted, the clearer it became that the darkness had edges. It had weight. It occupied space. And the most unsettling part was not what could be seen, but what could not. The object did not match any familiar shape. It did not suggest a tool, a trinket, or any natural form. It seemed instead to be something broken, or perhaps something incomplete, as though a fragment of a larger whole had been captured by the camera. The longer the photograph was studied, the more that hand seemed to draw attention, pulling the eye away from the smiling couple, away from the calm forest, toward that single, hidden detail. It was the first indication that the image was not a simple record of a celebration, but a carefully preserved moment of warning, frozen in time, waiting for someone to notice. The voices did not begin all at once. At first, there were only small disturbances, easy to dismiss, the kind that could be blamed on fatigue or imagination. A faint murmur when the room was otherwise silent. A breath that did not belong to anyone. The soft impression that someone had spoken from the far end of a corridor when no one was there. Those who had spent time studying the photograph noticed it first. They described a similar pattern. After hours of examining the image, adjusting contrast, isolating shadows, and returning again and again to the bride's clenched hand, their nights became restless. Sleep came lightly, and when it did not stay. They woke with the feeling that they had been called, though no sound remained in the air. The whispers were never clear. They carried no recognizable words. Instead, they resembled the sound of many distant voices layered together, like wind passing through a dense canopy of leaves. Sometimes they seemed to come from behind, sometimes from above, and sometimes from within the walls themselves. Most tried to ignore it. They turned on radios. They kept lamps burning. They told themselves that the mind, when focused too long on a single disturbing image, begins to invent patterns. But the voices persisted, soft but insistent, always just loud enough to be noticed, never loud enough to be proven. The most unsettling detail was their timing. The whispers never appeared during the day. They came only in the quiet hours, when the world outside had settled, when the photograph was out of sight, stored away in drawers or files, yet somehow still present. It was as though the image did not require being seen to be active, only remembered. Some reported hearing a woman's tone beneath the layered sound, low and strained, as if speaking through something thick and heavy. Others claimed they could hear more than one, overlapping, rising and falling in uneven rhythm, like a distant gathering deep within a forest. No one could record it. Every attempt to capture the sound resulted in silence, even when the listener was certain the voices had been clear only moments before. The absence on playback only deepened the unease, creating the impression that the sound was not traveling through the air at all, but through something less tangible. With time, those affected began to change their behavior. They avoided the dark. They hesitated before entering quiet rooms. They found themselves pausing in the middle of ordinary tasks, listening for something they could not explain. And always, when they returned to the photograph, the bride's expression seemed subtly altered, as though she were no longer simply posing, but waiting, and the forest behind her no longer appeared still, but filled with a presence that had finally found a way to be heard. The search for answers led away from the photograph and into the past. Local records were thin, incomplete, and in some places deliberately vague. The forest itself seemed to resist documentation, appearing only briefly in old maps, sometimes unnamed, sometimes marked with notes that had faded into illegibility. But in archives kept by the nearest town, in ledgers brittle with age and handwritten ink, patterns began to surface. There were reports of disappearances. They were not dramatic. There were no sensational headlines, no widespread investigations. Instead, they appeared as small notices, brief entries in parish books and municipal logs. A laborer who failed to return home after taking a shortcut through the woods. A young woman last seen gathering firewood near the tree line. A pair of children who wandered from a footpath and were never found. The dates were close together. Most unsettling of all, they followed the same year recorded on the wedding portrait's photographic style and materials. The weeks after the ceremony, which had been intended to mark the beginning of a family, became a quiet season of absence. No bodies were recovered. No clear explanations were offered. The forest was searched more than once, but the terrain was dense, the ground uneven, and the undergrowth thick enough to swallow sound. Those who went in spoke later of disorientation, of paths that seemed to double back on themselves, of a feeling that the woods were not simply a place, but a presence. As the records were compared, another detail emerged. The missing were not connected by blood or trade, but by proximity. Each had, at some point, been present in the area on the day of the wedding, either as a guest, a worker, or a passerby drawn by the rare gathering in such a remote place. The forest, it seemed, had not taken at random. The deeper the research went, the more resistance it met. Pages were torn from some volumes. Names were crossed out in others. In one instance, an entire register for that season was replaced with a later copy, the handwriting different, the ink darker, as though someone had attempted to rewrite the past. Older residents, when questioned, grew silent. They avoided direct answers. They spoke of bad years, of things best left undisturbed, of moments when it was wiser not to ask why. What began as a curiosity became a recognition. The wedding had not been an isolated event. It had been followed by a series of vanishings so quiet, so carefully absorbed into routine, that the town learned to live around them. The photograph, once a symbol of joy, now appeared as the still center of a widening circle of loss, and the forest, calm in the image, revealed itself as the one constant in every account. The truth about the bride was not something the town had forgotten, it was something it had never fully admitted. Over the decades, stories had drifted into rumor, fragments of conversations whispered in the shadows of old cottages, warnings that children were taught to heed without understanding why. When researchers began piecing together the events surrounding that long-ago wedding, what emerged was far darker than a simple tale of love or celebration. The bride had not been expected to survive her own wedding day. The cheerful portrait, the formal smile, the carefully arranged bouquet, these were all layers of a story meant to conceal what had really happened. She had known it, even as she posed. Even as her hand clutched something hidden beneath her fingers, she had understood the danger that lingered in the trees behind her, in the unseen eyes watching from the forest's edge. The object she held was never a gift, never a charm of happiness or luck. It was a warning, small and precise, its purpose encoded only in those who could see it and recognize the significance of its concealment. Her fingers curved around it with quiet insistence, pressing it inward with a force born not of love but of necessity. To the casual observer, it appeared accidental, or perhaps the natural tension of a bride nervous on her wedding day. But those who knew, or later learned, recognized the deliberate nature of that gesture. She had been holding a message, a signal that all was not as it seemed, that the day recorded in smiles and lace was in fact a day of impending calamity. Contemporaneous accounts, when compared with the photograph, hinted at unease among certain witnesses. Some villagers remembered the bride as distant in the weeks before the wedding, as though a shadow had followed her from the forest to the chapel. Others spoke of hushed conversations in the dead of night, of messages sent and received through cryptic notes. No record explicitly mentioned the object, but the pattern suggested preparation, a careful attempt to shield what could not otherwise be explained. Those who later examined the photograph in detail saw the hand, saw the dark shape almost swallowed by shadow, and felt a weight settle over them. The moment captured was not one of joy, it was a moment of survival, of quiet defiance. The bride had understood the forces arrayed around her, and in that understanding, she had acted. She had hidden a fragment of truth in plain sight, daring someone to notice it, daring someone to understand that she had not been a passive figure in her own story. The realization reframes everything. The portrait is no longer a simple record of matrimony. It becomes a warning, a testament to foresight and fear, and a reminder that behind the careful arrangement of smiles and ceremony, danger can wait patiently, even for a bride on the happiest day of her life. The photograph was never just a picture. At first, it seemed to exist solely as a relic of the past, a frozen memory of a single day in 1920, a bride and groom posing beneath a pale summer sky with the forest behind them. But the longer it was examined, the more it became clear that it was something far more deliberate, far more purposeful than anyone had imagined. Each detail, the tension in the bride's hand, the dark object hidden between her fingers, the stillness of the trees, was carefully preserved. It was a moment captured, yes, but it was also a door, a threshold between what had been seen and what had been waiting patiently to be revealed. Those who stared too long often felt that the image pulsed with a life of its own, that it was aware of being observed, aware of the attention that clung to it like dust. It began subtly. A faint movement in the shadows, a whisper that seemed to rise from the very fibers of the photograph, a sensation that the air around it had thickened. People described it differently, but all reported the same underlying feeling, the sense that something was trying to make itself known. At first, it was impossible to quantify, impossible to capture or explain. The sound recordings were empty. The enhanced images revealed only what had always been there, the small, clenched hand, the dark object, the calm yet unnatural composure of the bride. And yet, those who returned again and again to the photograph found themselves listening, waiting, and slowly realizing that the photograph had a voice, even if it could not speak in words. The closer one looked, the more the forest behind the couple seemed to shift, as if the shadows themselves were moving subtly, reshaping, curling into forms that the eye could just barely register. What had been background had become foreground, and the distance between observer and image began to shrink. Those who were sensitive to the sound, or thought they were, reported murmurs, whispers, and even brief phrases, unintelligible but unmistakably deliberate. The longer the gaze lingered, the more insistent the presence became, until the observer could no longer separate the photograph from the forest it depicted, from the hidden object in the bride's hand, from the echo of voices in the dark. It was then that the realization struck: the photograph was not a memory. It was a warning, yes, but also a mechanism, a subtle opening into something that had remained confined for over a century. Every observer risked letting it draw them in, letting it awaken what had been waiting, patient and unseen. The image had endured time, concealment, and the decay of memory to reach the right pair of eyes. Whoever looked too long was no longer merely observing history, they were part of its unfolding. It did not matter how careful one was, how rational or skeptical, the photograph's power lay in its quiet persistence, in the way it pulled, in the way it insisted on being heard, until the line between past and present, observer and observed, began to blur, and whatever the bride had tried to contain now had the chance to be heard again.